The wind howled across the Montana plains like it knew what Wyatt McCall was about to do. Dry grass rustled against the bones of the land, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote let out a cry that echoed through the valley like a last call. Wyatt stood at the edge of the bluff, boots firm on the brittle dirt, hat pulled low against the gusts. Below him stretched the broken remains of what used to be his life acres of ranchland, half of it scorched from last year's fire, the other half starved to death by drought. The barn leaned like an old drunk, half its roof peeled away by storms. The corral was empty, the fences falling in on themselves like the ribs of a dead animal. His horse, Rusty, stood tied to a bare post nearby, quiet and still. He'd raised that beast from a colt, and now the animal watched him with eyes that seemed to know. Wyatt's rifle lay propped against a dead log, next to a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey and a weather-worn leather-bound notebook. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold and the drink. He opened the notebook, flipping past pages of cattle counts, fence repairs, feed orders, and finally, to the page he'd written on that morning. To whoever finds me, don't waste your prayers. I'm already spent. Bury me by May if you've got the kindness left in you. Burn this place if you don't. Either way, it's all gone now. There's nothing left here but ghosts. He set the book down with care, as if it might break. The whiskey burned down his throat as he emptied the last of it, letting the fire spread through his chest like a last kind of warmth. Then he picked up his hat, dusted it off like habit still mattered, and walked to Rusty, tightening the saddle strap with automatic precision. The horse snorted softly, but didn't flinch. They'd ridden together for years through snowstorms, floods, branding seasons, and long summer droughts. Wyatt rested a weathered hand on the gelding's neck and took a slow, steady breath. The sky was the color of old tin flat and mean. A storm was brewing, but that didn't matter anymore. He mounted up, boots sliding into the stirrups with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He turned Rusty toward the southern ridge, the one place on the property where the cliffs rose high and the ground gave way to silence. That's where May had liked to ride, before the cancer took her. Wyatt hadn't been the same since. Her death had been slow, cruel, the kind that left a man standing with nothing but regrets and empty rooms echoing with memories. His son had left for the city not long after. Too much land, too little future, he'd said. Wyatt hadn't blamed him, not really. But after the cattle died and the bank stopped calling, after the neighbors stopped checking in, Wyatt started talking to the land like it was the last thing still listening. And today, even it had gone quiet. He nudged Rusty forward, the old horse stepping carefully across cracked earth and tangled brush. Each hoofbeat felt like a goodbye. Wyatt didn't cry. He hadn't cried in years. Not when May died. Not when the herd collapsed. Not when the last ranch hand left. But as he reached the ridge and saw the sky split with a single bolt of lightning in the far distance, he felt something deep in his chest twitch. Not fear, not doubt, just waiting. And that's when he heard it. A sound he hadn't expected. Not thunder, not wind. A whimper. Soft, broken, human. Wyatt pulled the reins hard, Rusty jolting beneath him. He turned toward the old barn, what was left of it. The sound had come from behind there. And just like that, the ride wasn't over. Wyatt swung down from Rusty, the old gelding shifting his weight with a grunt as Wyatt's boots hit the dry ground. The wind had dropped to a whisper now, like the world itself was holding its breath. He moved toward the barn, its sagging frame groaning under the weight of years and neglect. The sidewall had collapsed during last winter's storm, leaving a jagged scar of splintered beams and rotted boards. Wyatt barely glanced at it most days. Just one more thing broken on this land. But now he paused, the sound he'd heard still echoing faintly in his ears. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was softer than that, like a wounded breath caught between fear and surrender. A whimper, barely human. Wyatt's brow furrowed. He moved cautiously, stepping over a rusted feed bucket and past coils of barbed wire half buried in the dirt. The barn smelled of mildew and mice, old hay and ash. He stopped near the corner where the rubble lay heaviest, scanning for movement. Then he heard it again, this time clearer. A soft, broken cry. It came from behind the wreckage, down low. His pulse kicked up, instinct sharper now than despair. He pulled aside a length of fallen timber and crouched. That's when he saw it, a rusted iron hatch, barely visible beneath the debris, wedged into the base of the barn's outer wall. A cellar door, not one he remembered being there. Wyatt grabbed the rusted handle and yanked. It groaned, but didn't budge. He spat into his palm, gritted his teeth, and hauled again. With a final screech of protesting metal, the door gave way, revealing a yawning black hole beneath the barn. The air that escaped smelled of damp, rot, and something worse. Wyatt squinted into the darkness, his hand drifting toward the knife on his belt more out of habit than preparation. "Hello?" he called, voice rough with dust and disbelief. "Anyone down there?" For a moment, silence. Thin sound, shuffling, quick breathing, a single whisper. "Please." Wyatt stepped back like he'd been slapped. That voice. It was a child. He grabbed a rusted lantern from the barn wall and sparked it with trembling fingers. The flame caught, flickered weakly, then glowed just enough to push back the shadows. He descended 3 wooden steps, each creaking beneath his weight, until the lantern's light reached the far side of the cellar. And there they were. 6 children, huddled in the farthest corner, backs pressed to the wall, filthy, barefoot, eyes wide and sunken. Shackles bolted to the floor connected to their wrists and ankles with rusted chains that cut into raw skin. The oldest, a boy maybe 15, stood in front of the others like a guard dog made of sticks and fear. The smallest toddler clung to a girl with matted hair and a split lip. All of them stared at Wyatt like he was another monster come to finish what the last one started. He didn't speak, couldn't. He just stood there, lantern trembling in his hand, mouth dry, heart pounding so loud it hurt his ears. Those eyes, they were hollow and haunted, but they held something else, too. Something Wyatt hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. And he knew, in that instant, there was no going back to the cliff. No more final rides. No more graves. Something had found him in the dark, and this time, it needed saving. Wyatt stood in the cellar's mouth, the lantern shaking in his grip, shadows dancing across the dirt floor like restless spirits. The children didn't move, not a single one. The oldest boy stood tall, arms wide as if he could shield them from a man twice his size. His face was streaked with grime and defiance, but his lip quivered with the effort of standing so brave. Wyatt's mind fought itself, part of him still back on that cliff, where silence promised peace, where the world could end without witness. But this wasn't silence. This was breath and bruises and trembling little hands wrapped around each other like vines, desperate for something to hold. He took a step closer, raising the lantern higher. The toddler whimpered, hiding her face in the red-haired girl's neck. Wyatt stopped again, swallowing the knot rising in his throat. What the hell was this? Who chained up children in a hole like this? Why here? Why on his land? "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It sounded foreign in the space, too loud, too alive. The boy didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Wyatt lowered the lantern and took another look at the chains. They were thick, rusted, anchored deep into a metal bracket welded into the cement wall. The padlock was heavy, blackened with age. He cursed under his breath and turned, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. In the barn, he found an old pickaxe buried beneath the collapsed tack wall. His knees groaned as he dropped to the floor by the hatch again and slid down into the dark, breath-heavy, hands already blistering with memory. He didn't ask permission, didn't give them time to be afraid. He just raised the pickaxe and brought it down with a roar, sparks lighting up the small space as metal struck metal. The lock didn't break the first time, or the second, but on the third blow, something gave, and the padlock snapped in half, clattering to the floor like a dead thing. The chains rattled loose. The boy looked stunned. Like freedom was harder to trust than captivity. Wyatt dropped the pickaxe, panting, and crouched low, holding out a hand. "Come on," he said. "This place ain't fit for rats, let alone kids." Still, no one moved. Except the toddler. She turned in the red-haired girl's lap, her small hands reaching out, tears still streaking down her cheeks. Wyatt hesitated. His hands were calloused and dirty, rough from years of ranch work and sorrow, but he reached forward anyway, and she tumbled into his arms with a quiet sob, her tiny body no heavier than a sack of feed. She clung to his neck, her breath warm against his skin. Wyatt stood slowly, cradling her like a man waking from a long, hard dream. "Let's go," he said again, voice firmer this time. The others rose, one by one, legs stiff and uncertain. The red-haired girl carried herself like someone who'd had to be strong too long. The twins moved as a unit, flanking the boy with silent obedience. The youngest girl, no older than 6, followed last, eyes darting from corner to corner like she expected punishment for each step. They climbed out of the cellar in silence. Wyatt led them across the dry yard, past the sagging fence, up the creaking porch steps. His cabin looked like it hadn't seen life in a decade because it hadn't. The curtains were drawn tight, the windows streaked with dust, the rocking chair untouched since the day May died. He opened the door and stood aside, letting them pass. They entered like ghosts, one by one, eyes wide, arms close to their sides. The air inside was dry and still, heavy with the scent of old books, wood smoke, and something else grief that had nowhere left to go. Wyatt stood in the doorway a moment longer, the toddler still wrapped around his neck like a second chance. He didn't know who they were, didn't know what had happened, but as the door shut behind him, a truth settled in his bones deeper than the whiskey ever had. Whatever this was, it was his now. The cabin smelled like dust, cracked leather, and old coffee grounds. Wyatt moved through it like a stranger, the toddler still pressed to his chest, her small fingers curled into the collar of his flannel shirt. The other 5 children stood in the center of the living room like they didn't dare touch anything. Their eyes scanned the space, not with curiosity but with suspicion, as if waiting for the next blow or command. Wyatt gently set the girl barely 3 years old onto the threadbare couch and disappeared into the kitchen without a word. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. These weren't calves to be tagged or horses to be shoed. These were children, human ones, hungry, broken, and quiet in a way that made his gut twist. He rummaged through the cabinets, not much left. A few tins of beans, half a sack of flour, a jar of pickled onions that looked older than his saddle. He filled a pot with water and tossed in the beans, setting it to boil on the wood stove. He found a tin of corned beef in the back corner and cracked it open with a dull knife. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was food. He divided the beef onto 6 chipped plates, added a slice of dry bread to each, and set them on the table like he'd done 100 times before, except never for company like this. The oldest boy, tall but rail-thin, kept the others behind him even as Wyatt motioned toward the table. "Food's ready," Wyatt said. "Ain't fancy, but it's hot." No one moved. The boy's eyes locked onto Wyatt's face with a weight that belonged on a grown man, not a child. Finally, he nodded once, and the others crept forward like stray dogs waiting to be kicked. They sat, rigid and silent. The toddler climbed into the red-haired girl's lap and buried her face in her shoulder. Wyatt sat across from them but didn't eat. He just watched, arms folded, trying to process what in God's name had landed in his lap. They ate slowly, mechanically, chewing like they didn't trust the food to stay in their mouths. Wyatt noticed the redhead winced when lifting her arm. A deep bruise peeked through the sleeve of her ragged shirt. One of the twins limped when he got up to fetch water. The youngest girl had cracked lips and a sunken look in her eyes like she hadn't known kindness in months. After they finished, Wyatt retrieved a metal basin and filled it with warm water. He didn't say a word, just set it on the floor beside the fire and gestured. The children hesitated, but eventually lined up. He cleaned scraped knees and wiped dirt from sunken cheeks. He removed a splinter from the smallest boy's foot while the child sat frozen, as if bracing for pain that never came. Only when the basin water turned brown and the children were wrapped in old wool blankets did the boy finally speak. "My name's Caleb," he said. His voice cracked with disuse, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I'm the oldest." Wyatt nodded once. "Wyatt McCall." "A Pause." "We didn't mean to come here," Caleb added, voice low. "Our step-uncle, he sold us. Said we were too much trouble. Gave us to men who were going to take us south. Told them this barn was empty. That no one would notice if they stashed us here for a few days." Wyatt's stomach turned. His hand closed slowly into a fist, the scar on his knuckle whitening. He stood, crossed the room, and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the wall like it could explain this cruelty. He thought about picking up the phone, calling Tucker, or the state boys over in Billings. But he'd seen how that played out before. Reports lost, evidence mishandled, kids relocated to places that looked safe on paper but weren't. He'd buried one too many neighbors who waited for the law to do the right thing and ran out of time instead. He glanced back at the children, Caleb watching him, the girl rocking the baby, the twins huddled together, the youngest curled up with her thumb in her mouth. Wyatt knew justice moved slow in Montana, but evil didn't wait. And these kids? They couldn't afford to wait either. Not again. Morning light crept in slow through the cracked blinds, casting long stripes across the floorboards of Wyatt's cabin. The fire had died down to faint embers, and the room smelled of damp wool, old wood, and something warmer, hope, maybe. The kids were still asleep, huddled in a pile of blankets and borrowed shirts. Caleb had kept watch most of the night from the rocker near the door, eyes barely blinking. Wyatt had told him to sleep. The boy hadn't listened. Didn't trust the dark, Wyatt figured. Wyatt stood at the kitchen sink with a chipped mug of coffee, staring out at the frost-covered field. The ranch looked the same as it had yesterday, dead fences, brittle pasture, barn tilting to one side like it was done trying to stand. But something had shifted. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt tense, alive, holding its breath. That's when he heard it. Boots on gravel, slow, deliberate. Wyatt set down the mug and moved toward the front door. Before he could reach it, a sharp knock rang through the cabin. Not frantic, not polite, just loud enough to make the kids jolt awake. Caleb was on his feet instantly. Wyatt didn't need to tell him what to do. "Cellar," he said. No questions, no delay. The children disappeared through the trapdoor beneath the braided rug in the kitchen floor, the same spot Wyatt had used to store preserves and deer jerky back when May was alive. Caleb closed it gently behind them, flipping the rug back into place just as Wyatt opened the front door. Sheriff Tucker stood on the porch, chewing a toothpick like he had all the time in the world. His coat flapped in the cold wind, badge glinting in the morning sun. "Well, I'll be," Tucker drawled, eyes scanning the front of the cabin. "Didn't expect to see you up and about, Wyatt." "Didn't expect company," Wyatt replied, voice flat. Tucker chuckled. "Neighbor said they saw smoke coming out your chimney. Said they thought you were dead." "Not yet." "Glad to hear it," Tucker said, stepping closer, eyes narrowing just enough to make Wyatt's spine stiffen. "Funny thing, though. Another neighbor up north said they spotted movement on your land. Thought maybe some squatters were using the old barn." "Squatters?" Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "Place barely stands. Anyone dumb enough to hole up in there wouldn't last through the night." "Still," Tucker said, brushing past Wyatt without waiting, stepping into the cabin uninvited. His boots thudded against the worn floor as he scanned the room. "Mind if I take a look around? Already inside, aren't you?" Tucker grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Routine check, just making sure all's quiet out here." He moved slowly, gaze lingering on the fire pit, the stack of blankets by the hearth, the basin still damp from last night's cleaning. Wyatt kept his posture relaxed, but his blood ran cold. Tucker wasn't stupid. He was reading everything. After a few minutes of silent tension, Tucker turned back toward the door. He paused at the threshold, shifting the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "You know, Wyatt," he said casually, "it's a serious offense harboring fugitives." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Didn't know I was." "Even if they're small," Tucker added, eyes flicking to the rug for a beat too long. The air between them turned to stone. "Best be careful what you let wander onto your land," the sheriff said finally. "Sometimes trouble comes in small packages." Then he tipped his hat and stepped back out onto the porch, boots crunching over gravel as he disappeared into the morning fog. Wyatt stood frozen until the sound of the sheriff's truck faded down the dirt road. Then he locked the door, walked to the trapdoor, and pulled it open. The kids were silent as they climbed out, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Wyatt met Caleb's stare. "Not yet," he said, "but they're coming." And when they did, Wyatt knew he'd have to choose law or justice. And for the first time in years, the choice felt easy. The door creaked on its hinges as Wyatt pushed it open, dust rising from the worn wooden floor like breath from a long-forgotten grave. The quilting room. May's room. He hadn't crossed that threshold in 7 years, not since the morning after she passed, when he'd folded her last half-stitched blanket and laid it across the rocking chair like a burial cloth. He'd closed the door after Thathard like shutting it could lock the ache away for good. Now it stood open again, spilling lamplight across shelves of faded fabric and baskets of thread that hadn't seen daylight in nearly a decade. The children had drifted off here, all 6 of them tangled in blankets and makeshift beds across the floor. Caleb lay nearest the door, as always, one arm crooked protectively behind his head. The red-haired girl Lila, she'd whispered the night before, curled on a pile of old quilts with the toddler pressed into her side. The twins were sprawled together like mirror images, feet tucked under a braided rug. And the littlest one, the thumbsucker, had fallen asleep in May's old rocker, her head tilted just so, as if she belonged there. Wyatt stood in the doorway, arms folded across his chest, and listened to them breathe. Soft, uneven, still half-bracing for the next blow in their dreams. He watched the youngest twitch in her sleep, her brow creased with worry even now. He didn't know all their names yet, but he knew enough. Enough to see the bruises beneath their sleeves, the caution in their movements, the flinch that followed any sudden sound. They were skittish as colts, and just as easy to spook. This room had once been full of laughter. May used to sing while she quilted, her voice soft and warbling like the wind through pine trees. She'd call Wyatt in when she wanted his opinion on calorzas, if he had any sense for such things, and he'd stand there pretending to care, just to hear her talk. She'd wanted children, but the Lord hadn't given them any. They'd filled the house with stitched teddy bears and little booties anyway, just in case. Now, without warning, the house was full of children, and not one stitch of his life had been ready for it. Wyatt stepped back into the hall and let the door rest, half shut behind him. He wandered the house in silence, boots scuffing over floorboards that remembered better years. Every room held a ghost. The kitchen, where May had fried eggs on Sunday mornings. The porch, where they used to sit with coffee and say nothing for hours. Even the hallway smelled like her sometimes lavender and pine, or maybe that was just memory twisting the air. He passed the old mirror in the foyer and caught a glimpse of himself. Grayer than he remembered, eyes tired and hollow, but something else flickered there to an edge he hadn't seen in years. A spark of usefulness, a glimmer of purpose. The children hadn't said much, but they didn't need to. Their presence filled the empty spaces like water creeping into dry soil. They hadn't just interrupted his silence, they'd broken it. Split it wide open. And he didn't know if he was ready for that, didn't know if he could be what they needed. But as he moved quietly through the house, adjusting blankets, checking the locks, stirring the fire back to life, something in him whispered that maybe he didn't need to be perfect. Maybe just being here was the first step. He paused again outside the quilting room, watching the lamplight flicker against the pale wall where May's sewing machine still sat, untouched. He didn't go in. Not yet. But he didn't close the door either. That was something. Tomorrow would come fast. And this time, Wyatt McCall wasn't going to meet it alone. The morning came slow and gray, with clouds hanging low over the land like a warning. Wyatt chopped wood behind the house, the rhythm of it steady but sharp. Every swing of the axe bit deep, not just into the bark, but into something tangled in his chest. The wind stung his face, but he welcomed it. It kept him from thinking too hard. Kept him from looking at the cellar door and remembering what he'd found there. Inside the cabin, the kids stayed quiet. Caleb kept them busy with chores. Wyatt hadn't asked them to do folding blankets, sweeping corners, sorting beans. They moved like shadows, not waiting for permission, but always watching. And then there was Lila. She hadn't spoken since that first night, not one word. She kept the toddler close and avoided Wyatt's eyes like he was just another set of boots waiting to drop. Every time he spoke, she flinched. Not big, just a small tightening of the shoulders, a breath caught mid-chest, but he saw it, every time. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to darken again, storm clouds piling like judgment over the hills. Wyatt stepped inside with a pail of water and paused. Lila sat alone in the corner, the toddler finally napping in her lap. Caleb and the others were out back feeding the chickens. She didn't see him at first. She was staring at the fire, her hand moving in slow circles over the baby's back. He moved carefully, not wanting to startle her. Set the pail down, took a breath, then lowered himself to the edge of the rocking chair. "You warm enough?" he asked softly. She gave a single nod. No words. Wyatt rubbed his hands together. "I reckon this place isn't much, but I'm working on it. Mamie wife used to keep it like a postcard. Quilts on every bed, fresh bread every other morning. Could make this old place feel like a palace." He smiled faintly. "She would have liked you." Lila didn't move. He sighed. "I don't need to know everything, but I want you to know. Whatever happened to you, it wasn't right, and it damn sure wasn't your fault." That's when her fingers stopped moving. Her head lifted, just a little. Then she spoke, so softly it almost got lost in the crackle of the fire. "They chained us together in a basement before we came here," she said. "No windows, just a bucket in the corner. If you cried, he made you wish you hadn't." Wyatt's breath left his chest. "He?" he asked carefully. Lila nodded. Her eyes stayed on the fire. "Big man, beard, always smelled like beer and sweat. Said we were property, said nobody cared." Wyatt stared at the flames. His knuckles turned white on the arm of the chair. He forced his voice to stay steady. "Did he hurt you?" Lila's lips trembled. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Wyatt's hands began to shake. He clenched them into fists, willing the rage to stay down, but it rose anyway fast, thick, cold. He felt it in his chest, behind his eyes, in the way his jaw locked like he was holding back a scream. She was just a kid. Just a quiet little girl who had learned that silence was safer than speech. And someone had done this to her. Wyatt stood and paced to the window, staring out over the land he'd thought was forgotten. But now it made sense. Why here? Why his land, empty, remote, off the map? No one would come looking. No one had. Someone had picked this place on purpose. He turned back toward Lila. She hadn't moved. "You ain't property," he said, voice gravel and thunder. Not to him, not to anyone. She looked up at him then, really looked. And for the first time, Wyatt saw the tiniest flicker of belief in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something beginning. He went out to the barn after that. Didn't say a word. Just stood there staring at the rusted chain still lying in the cellar. Then he kicked it, hard. And again. Until his boot split and his breath came ragged. Because justice wasn't coming fast enough. So Wyatt McCall started planning. The sky was the same dull gray it had been the day Wyatt rode out to end his life. Cold wind skimmed across the field, whispering through brittle grass, rattling fence wire like a ghost too restless to settle. He stood at the edge of that familiar rise now, not with a rifle, not with a letter in his pocket, but with a shovel slung over his shoulder and a coil of rusted chain wrapped tight in his hand. The earth gave reluctantly beneath his boots, frozen near the top, soft with decay underneath. He struck it over and over, each thrust of the shovel punctuated by breath clouds and old bones grinding in his knees. But he didn't stop. Not this time, not here, not now. This wasn't a grave he was digging. Not anymore. The children arrived in a quiet line, one by one, as if summoned by instinct or something deeper. Caleb came first, standing a few paces behind Wyatt, watching with his arms crossed and his jaw set. The twins trailed him, their usual twin silence louder than words. Lila came next, holding the toddler's hand. The red-haired girl had braided her hair today tight, purposeful, and Wyatt noticed it like it meant something. The youngest girl clung to her side, thumb in mouth, but eyes sharp, watching every move Wyatt made. He cleared the earth in a wide circle, shallow and flat. Then he stepped back, wiped the sweat from his brow, and threw the chains into the pit. They landed with a hard clatter, the iron slithering like a snake that should have died long ago. "Bring me the kindling," he said, not looking up. Caleb obeyed without question. Dry wood, twigs, bits of splintered barn boards. Wyatt stacked it with precision. Then he poured the oil, thick, heavy. The scent of it burned his nose. He struck a match. Flames leapt up fast, wild and angry, curling around the metal like it was hungry for revenge. The children didn't speak. They just watched. The fire roared, devouring the wood, licking the iron, turning rust to red and red to molten glow. Sparks flew into the sky like fireflies with purpose, drifting into the darkening clouds above. Wyatt stepped back, his silhouette flickering in the firelight. He looked at them, all 6 faces bathed in orange and gold, eyes wide and silent. "I planned to die here," he said quietly. "Just days ago. Had the grave ready and everything." No one moved. But then someone else needed saving, and I figured maybe that meant I was still useful. He nodded toward the fire. "These chains, they're not just steel, they're lies. They told you you weren't worth protecting, that you were less than human, that no one would come." He paused, voice tight. "Well, I'm here now, and I ain't going anywhere." The wind shifted, blowing smoke sideways. The toddler sneezed and Lila held her close. One of the twins wiped his nose with his sleeve. And still, none of them said a word. But Wyatt didn't need words. The chains twisted in the fire, curling into ash and memory. The flames began to die down, but the warmth lingered, wrapping around the children like a promise. A grave had been reclaimed today, and something stronger had taken its place. The snow came early that year, dusting the ranch in a quiet blanket of white that muffled footsteps and softened the jagged world. Wyatt had been counting days, 21 since he'd sent the letter. Sealed it tight, addressed it to an old friend, Jonas Holt, who once bled beside him in a jungle they never talked about. Jonas had gone federal after the war. Some kind of child rescue task force, Wyatt remembered. The man knew how to disappear problems and make them right again. If anyone could help these kids without dragging them through courtrooms and headlines, it was Jonas. But weeks passed, and the mailbox stayed empty. Wyatt kept the children close, kept the rifles loaded, and taught them everything he could without scaring the soul out of them. Caleb learned fast, took to handling the woodpile like a man twice his size. The twins Eli and Evan turned out to be clever with rope, practicing knots and snares behind the barn. Lila never left the toddler's side, but she listened hard. She watched Wyatt fix fence posts and change the oil on the generator, absorbing every quiet motion. And the littlest Gracie, they'd decided, followed Wyatt around with wide eyes and tiny boots, copying how he walked, how he set his jaw. They were healing, piece by piece, and Wyatt, though he didn't dare say it aloud, had started to hope. Then came the night the dogs wouldn't stop barking. It was just past midnight. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows on the living room walls where the children lay curled in their makeshift beds. Wyatt was at the table, cleaning his shotgun. Old habit. Never slept much anymore. When the dogs howled again, sharp, frantic, not the kind of bark you ignore, Wyatt rose slowly, breath freezing in his chest. He looked out the window. 3 vehicles. Headlights off. Doors opening. Men with rifles stepping into the snow like wolves. He moved fast, low, and quiet. Caleb was already awake, crouched by the front door with a knife in his hand and fear written across his face. Wyatt took the knife, set it down, and handed the boy the smaller shotgun instead. Basement, Wyatt whispered. Now. He didn't argue. The children moved like smoke, disappearing into the trapdoor without a sound. Wyatt set the rug back in place and locked the cellar from above. It wasn't much protection, but it bought time. Then he turned off every light, pulled the blackout curtains, and slid into position behind the sofa. The front door creaked. A heavy bootstep. "McCall," a voice snarled. "We know you've got our property." Wyatt's voice came out low, cold as the steel in his hands. "Ain't got a thing that belongs to you." Another voice, sharp, nasal. "We'll burn it all down before we leave empty." Wyatt fired first. The window exploded, the blast echoing like thunder across the empty fields. One man screamed. Another cursed and ducked. Wyatt rolled to the back room, counting steps, movements. These bastards thought they were taking back cargo. They weren't ready for a house that had nothing left to lose. Gunfire ripped through the walls. Wyatt returned fire with the old hunting rifle from May's closet, clipped a man in the shoulder through the kitchen window. Then he heard a tone of the twins, banging a pot downstairs, a signal they'd rehearsed. Intruder in the back. Wyatt sprinted to the side door, caught the silhouette of a man near the porch, and slammed into him full force. They both hit the snow hard. Wyatt's fist connected with teeth. The man shrieked and went limp. More shouting. Fencerins. Fast. Close. Red and blue lights cutting through the trees. Jonas had koam. Wyatt dropped to his knees, breath heavy, blood on his knuckles, heart pounding like war drums in his ears. The men scattered like roaches. Some were caught. One tried to run and didn't make it far. By dawn, the snow was red in patches, the porch riddled with bullet holes, and Wyatt's cabin looked like it had fought back. Because it had. Jonas found Wyatt sitting on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes on the horizon. "You always did wait till the last damn second," Wyatt muttered. Jonas chuckled, jaw tight. "You always did make a mess worth cleaning up." And beneath the floorboards, 6 children sat huddled in silence. Alive, safe. And no longer anyone's property. The morning after the shootout rose cold and clean. A soft hush blanketed the land where blood had frozen into the snow, and bullet casings glinted like forgotten coins near the porch steps. Smoke still curled from the shattered eaves where Wyatt's shotgun had torn through wood and glass, but the air held a stillness now, not the kind that came before a storm, but the kind that came after a battle had been won. Even the wind felt different, like it no longer carried ghosts. One man was dead. 2 others were handcuffed in the back of federal vehicles, wrapped in thermal blankets and under heavy guard. Jonas stood beside them, coat open, breath steaming, a clipboard in one hand, and a quiet fury in his eyes. Wyatt didn't ask what would happen next. He didn't care to hear the details. He only cared that the children were alive, that they had made it. Inside, Sheriff Tucker paced through the wreckage of Wyatt's living room, one boot carefully stepping over splintered wood, the other pausing beside the trapdoor now wide open. The kids had come up minutes ago, blinking under the new sunlight, quiet but standing taller than Wyatt had ever seen them. Tucker watched them for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to Wyatt, who stood near the hearth with his arms crossed, jaw tight from bruises and blood. "You really went and made this your fight," Tucker said, not without a hint of admiration. "Could have sat still and let the law handle it." "I did let the law handle it," Wyatt muttered. "Took 3 weeks and a gunfight to show up." Tucker snorted. "Fair enough." He looked at Jonas, then back at Wyatt. "They're processing this through the system. Could take months, maybe longer. These kids," he paused, watching Lila straighten the blanket around the toddler. "They're gonna need a place to land until that happens." "They're already home," Wyatt said simply. Jonas nodded in agreement, flipping through the last page on his clipboard. "I can fast-track emergency guardianship. Full legal custody will take more paperwork, but if you're serious—" "I am." No hesitation. Tucker studied Wyatt for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, pulling a pen from his chest pocket and holding it out. "Sign here," he said, "and keep him out of trouble." Wyatt signed his name with steady hands. It was the same signature he'd written on cattle deeds, tax records, and war documents. But this one felt different. This one felt like it meant something permanent. That evening, the cabin pulsed with quiet energy. The fire crackled again, not in desperation, but in warmth. Laughter echoed faintly through the attic as Wyatt hammered in the last screw on a bunk bed frame. Caleb and the twins hauled up mattresses, while Lila fluffed pillows she'd carefully stitched shut with spare thread. Gracie ran in circles with a wooden spoon, giggling for the first time Wyatt could remember. May's old attic had become something new. A place to grow. A place to stay. After the kids had gone to bed, Wyatt returned to the bottom drawer of his old desk. He opened it slowly and pulled out the envelope he'd sealed on the day he meant to die. The paper inside was still crisp. Still smelled like whiskey and dirt and goodbye. He tore it in half. Then in half again. He tossed the pieces into the fire, watching them curl into nothing. When he turned around, Lila stood behind him with something in her hands. A piece of paper, folded. She held it out without a word. Wyatt opened it carefully. A drawing, crude and sweet. 6 children in front of a crooked cabin. A big man behind them, gray beard, heavy boots, a smile drawn with a shaky hand. The word, family, scratched in block letters at the bottom. Wyatt's throat burned. He placed it on the mantel above the fire, right where the wedding photo used to sit. Because blood had built this land. But love was building the home.